In this lecture, we will learn about for loops. There are times in programming when we want to execute code multiple times. Let's say we want to print hello world to the console 5 times. Using the knowledge we know so far, our only option would be to actually write 5 lines of code, one for every time we want to print to the console. But it takes a lot of unnecessary effort and can be time consuming. Also, if we want to change the text being printed, we would have to change the text on all 5 of these lines. In a situation where we know the amount of times we want a block of code to repeat, we can use a control flow statement called a for loop. Let's rewrite this code in the syntax of a for loop. The first step is to use the for keyword. Then comes an opening and closing parenthesis, inside of which go 3 statements. Then we initialize an int as the first statement, add the condition as the second statement, and increase or decrease the value as the third statement. The first and second statements have semicolons after them, signifying where that statement stops and the next statement begins. After that, we have an opening and closing curly brace, and the line of code to print hello world to the console inside of curly braces. We will break down the code we typed in a moment, but first let's run the code. As you can see, the phrase hello world was printed to the console 5 times. This for loop was able to execute the code inside of it 5 times. Why was that? The key is the 3 statements that come inside of the parentheses. The first statement here creates an int variable I and gives it a value of 0. The second statement specifies that the for loop should execute while I is less than 5. The third statement is run after each time the for loop is executed. In this case, we are adding 1 or incrementing the I variable each time after the code inside of the for loop is run. So I starts out with a value of 0, increases each time the loop is run, and runs while I is less than 5. So the code will run as I equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is a total of 5 times. Hence, we get 5 hello world statements logged to the console. When a for loop is executing, each execution of the for loop is called an iteration. Let's look at another example of how we can use a for loop in C#. This time, we are going to write a for loop that will take any string and print the letters out one by one to the console. To start out, let's create a string variable. We can give it any string we want and the code will work, because we are going to write some code that is generic enough to apply to any string. In this example, I will give our variable a value of ABC. Then comes our for loop. Similar to the last example, we will have an int variable named I that starts out at 0. For the second statement in the parentheses, we will specify while I is less than example.length. As the third statement, we will increase I by 1 each time. Inside of the for loop, we will print the letter in our string example at the index I that we are currently on for this iteration. When we iterate over a for loop, it does not have to go forwards. We can also iterate backwards. Let's modify our current example to print out the letters to the console in reverse order. We will start I out at the length of example -1. Recall that the elements in our string are indexed, 0, 1, and 2, since indexing in C# starts at 0. The length of the string example is 3, so it would be invalid to reference example at index 3, because there is no element at that index. The second statement inside of the parentheses will be while I is greater than or equal to 0. We need to say greater than and not less than, since we are going backwards and not forwards this time. The third statement will be I minus, decreasing I by 1 each time. When going backwards through a for loop, we use minus so that we decrease the value of the iterator variable over each iteration of the for loop. Now, when we run the code, you will notice that the letters were printed in reverse order to the console, in the order C, B, A. Note that we can choose not to specify the statements inside of the parentheses in the for loop. In order to make the code work though, we would have to initialize the variable before the for loop, and then define the condition and steps inside of the for loop. Let's start out by initializing an int variable I to 0 outside of the for loop. Also, even though I am naming it I, it can be named anything. Using the letter I actually stands for iterator, and it is the common notation to see when using for loops. Then comes the for keyword, parentheses, and 2 semicolons, with none of the statements in the parentheses that usually go there. Inside of the for loop, we will check if I is less than 4. If that is the case, we will print the value of I to the console. Then we will increment I. When we run this code, you will notice that 0, 1, 2, and 3 were printed to the console, just like we intended. This proves that we can use a for loop without any statements inside of the parentheses, just by having 2 semicolons inside of the parentheses. It is also possible to nest for loops. This is when we have a for loop inside of another for loop. The first for loop will start with I at 0, execute while I is less than 5, and then increment I by 1 each time. The second for loop will start j at 0, execute while j is less than 5, and increment j by 1 each time. Inside of the second for loop, we will print the value of I and j each time. What do you think will happen when we run this code? Okay, I'll ask a better question. Pause the video and write down how many times you think the first for loop will run. Then write down how many times you think the second for loop will run. Then, we will run the code. Are the results as you expected? Note that the first for loop ran 5 times. The second for loop ran 25 times. We can tell this because each time I changed values, all of the values of j, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, were printed. When you have a for loop nested inside of another for loop, the inner loop will execute for all of the iterations, and then the outer loop will execute its next iteration. So every one iteration of the outer loop resulted in 5 iterations of the inner loop. To recap, here are the key points that we learned about for loops. A for loop is used to execute a block of code repeatedly when we know the number of needed iterations, or times that the code inside of the loop needs to be executed. The for loop has 3 statements inside of the parentheses: initialization, condition, and increment or decrement. We don't have to specify statements in the for loop if we don't want. We can use 2 semicolons instead, but then we have to manually make sure that the for loop has a terminating condition. Also, we can nest loops in C#. In the next lecture, we will learn about for each loops.